The most powerful thing you ever said was probably something you didn't. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere in your past, there was a room, a conversation, a moment when every part of you wanted to speak, to defend yourself, to correct someone, to prove that you knew, and you stayed quiet. Not because you were weak, because something in you understood that silence was the stronger move. You felt this, I know you have. That strange authority that settles over a person who doesn't rush to fill the air. You've stood next to someone like that. Maybe a grandfather who answered hard questions with a long look before a single word. Maybe a woman at work who never argued, and somehow always won. And you remember thinking, what do they know that I don't? Here's what most people believe. That the person who speaks well is the person who holds the power. We raised entire generations on this idea: speak up, sell yourself. The loudest voice wins the room. But the truth is stranger than that. The people who shaped history's deepest thinking, the Stoics of ancient Rome, the elders of nearly every tradition on earth, believed almost exactly the opposite. They saw words the way a careful man sees money. You can spend them, or you can keep them, and what you keep grows. They weren't quiet because they had nothing to say. They were quiet because they understood something about words that we have almost completely forgotten, something that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. It changes how you sit in a room, how you listen to your own family, how you argue, and how you stop needing to. That's what this is about. Not tips on communication, something older than that. Let me show you where I first understood it. There was a man named Marcus, not the emperor. But we'll come to him. This Marcus was a farmer in his 70s, the kind of man you'd find in any small town in this country. His neighbors told the same story about him for years. When the county tried to run a road through his land, they held a public meeting. Lawyers spoke, officials spoke, angry neighbors spoke. For 2 hours, voices rising over each other like water over stones. Marcus sat in the third row and said nothing. Near the end, the county commissioner, maybe out of politeness, maybe out of nerves, turned to him and said, "Sir, it's your land. Don't you have anything to say?" Marcus stood up slowly. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't been all evening, and he said 11 words, just 11. Then he sat back down. The road was never built. Now, people who tell that story usually focus on what he said. But they're looking at the wrong thing. The 11 words weren't the power. Any man in that room could have spoken them. The power was the 2 hours of silence that came before. Because while everyone else was spending, Marcus was gathering. Every argument revealed, every temper lost, every card laid on the table. He watched it all. By the time he stood up, he knew the room completely. And the room knew nothing about him. That's not shyness. That's not passivity. That is a discipline. One the ancients practiced deliberately. The way we practice anything worth mastering. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because if silence is really that powerful, it raises a question most of us would rather not ask. Why can't we stop talking? Why do we explain ourselves to people who never asked? Why do we replay conversations at 2 a.m, editing what we said, adding what we should have said? Why does silence, even 10 seconds of it, at a dinner table, on a phone call, feel almost unbearable? The Stoics had an answer, and it's not flattering. It has to do with what we're actually doing when we talk too much, what we're giving away without realizing it. Because every unnecessary word, it turns out, is a small payment. And most of us have been paying every day for our entire lives without ever once asking what it costs. That's where we go next. So what does it cost? A word. The Stoics believe that every time you speak without needing to, you make a trade. And like most bad trades, you don't notice it happening. You only notice, years later, that something is missing. Start with the smallest payment information. Epictetus, a man who was born a slave and became one of the most respected teachers in Rome, told his students something that sounds almost rude to modern ears. "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth," he said, "so that we might listen twice as much as we speak." Simple, almost a grandmother's saying. But underneath it is a colder observation. Every time you talk, you are handing the room a map of yourself. What angers you, what flatters you, what you're afraid of, where you bend. The listener collects, the talker distributes. Think of the best poker player you've ever known, or the best negotiator, or the calmest person in your family during a crisis. Their advantage was never that they knew more, it's that you knew less about them. But information is only the first payment. There's a second one, and it's heavier. Pressure. Have you ever noticed that when you announce a plan, a diet, a business, a book you're gonna write, the announcing itself feels like an accomplishment? You say it out loud, people nod, someone says "good for you," and something inside you relaxes, exhales, as if a payment came due and applause settled the bill. The old-timers knew this instinctively. Don't show the crop before the harvest. There's a reason that instinct existed in every farming town in America. Spoken dreams leak the energy that should have driven the work, gets spent at the dinner table instead in the telling and retelling. The words didn't describe the dream. The words replaced it. That's the second cost. But there's a third. And this is the one the Stoics considered most dangerous of all. Because this one doesn't leak outward. It reshapes you. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor this time, ruled the most powerful empire on earth. He could have said anything to anyone at any moment and thousands would have obeyed. And yet at night, alone, he filled a private journal with reminders to himself. Say less than necessary. Don't perform. Let the deeds speak. The most powerful voice in the world spent his evenings practicing restraint like a musician practices scales. Why? What did an emperor have to fear from his own talking? He understood something we've lost. Every unnecessary word you speak is a small act of asking. Asking to be seen, asking to be agreed with, asking to be reassured. And a man who is always asking, even in tiny, invisible ways, slowly trains himself to need the answer. That's what overtalking really is. Underneath, it isn't a habit of the mouth. It's a hunger of the self. A quiet dependence on other people's reactions, fed 100 times a day. One comment, one correction, one self-defense at a time. And here's the uncomfortable part. The part you may already be feeling. We have built the noisiest world in human history. A world where silence is treated as a problem to be fixed. Where every thought is meant to be posted, every opinion registered, every dinner table filled edge to edge with talk. We are spending more words per day than any generation that has ever lived. And we are, by almost every measure, more anxious, more fragile, and more desperate to be understood than any generation that has ever lived. The Stoics would look at those two facts and say, of course, those arrive together. One is paying for the other. Which leaves the real question, the one this entire idea has been walking toward. If every wasted word is a payment, then what exactly is silence buying? What did the farmer in that meeting room have? What did the emperor at his desk have that the rest of us keep trading away? Because it isn't just power over a room. It's something you can carry into an ordinary Tuesday, into a kitchen, into the hardest conversation in your family. And that's where this becomes about you. What does silence buy? The Stoics had a word for it: self-possession, being the owner of yourself, instead of renting yourself out sentence by sentence to everyone in the room. Because that's the answer to the emperor's riddle. When Marcus Aurelius practiced saying less, he wasn't hoarding words like coins in a jar. He was buying back the one thing every wasted word had been selling: the need for other people to finish him, to approve him, to tell him he was right. A man who doesn't need the room's reaction is the only free man in the room. If this way of seeing things speaks to you, this channel, Expansion of Consciousness, is where we explore it, one idea at a time. Subscribing takes a second, and it tells me you want to keep walking this road together, because most people will never sit with ideas like this, and you're still here, which tells me something about you. You've lived long enough to have a history with words, decades of them, and somewhere in that history, be honest now, there are words you'd pay almost anything to take back. Something said to a son or a daughter in anger that landed deeper than you ever intended. An argument you won, in a marriage that lost advice you gave when what was needed was only your ear. And there are the other ones, the words you held, the night you sat with someone who was grieving and offered nothing but your presence. And years later, they told you it was the thing they remembered, the apology you didn't demand, the last word you let someone else have because you finally understood that needing it was the weakness. Notice which ones you regret. Almost no one, near the end of a long life, says, "I wish I had talked more." But every honest person carries a list of things they wish they hadn't said, and a longer list of moments when they wish they had simply listened. The spender and the gatherer live inside all of us. Every conversation, we choose which one holds the pen. Which brings us back to a meeting room and a farmer in the third row. People ask what the 11 words were, as if the words were the secret. But you already know better than that now. Still, since you stayed this long, you've earned them. He stood up, looked at the commissioner and said, "I buried 2 sons on this land, build your road elsewhere." Then he sat down. 2 hours of other people's noise, answered by a lifetime compressed into 11 words. That's what gathering buys. When a quiet person finally speaks, they aren't adding to the noise. They're spending a fortune all at once, and everyone in the room can feel the weight of it. Your words carry that same potential weight. Everyone you don't waste today is deposited into everyone you'll need tomorrow. So here's the only question that matters now. Somewhere in your week, maybe in your house, maybe on a phone call you've been putting off, there's a conversation waiting for you. And in that conversation, there's something you're aching to say. A correction, a defense, a last word. What would happen if you didn't say it? Tell me in the comments. Not the theory, your story. A moment when silence served you better than speech ever could. Or a moment you wish it had. I read them all. And the honest ones often become the seed of the next video. So if there's an idea you want us to sit with next, leave it there. And if someone came to mind while you listened, someone who spends too much, or someone who taught you how to gather, share this with them. Sometimes, the wisest thing we ever say to another person is nothing at all.